Historical interpretations of fascism have often been plagued by its shrouded origins and ultimately by its infamous relationship with National Socialism. However, many of such interpretations are deeply littered in a lack of understanding the specific framework of the fascist state and its association with the individual. Many conflate fascism with Nazism and often split the overall doctrine into two respective German and Italian camps. I do not intend to espouse political rhetoric of fascism in this video. Rather, the intent is to analyze the idea of what fascism is and why so many get it wrong. I especially find it relevant in that I studied the fascistic philosophy in my youth. Therefore, I feel I have a well-rounded knowledge and curiosity in the subject, especially since my mother's family is actually Jewish. This became more apparent when during my high school years I once exclaimed to my peer that fascism was simply not the same as Nazism. To my delight, the teacher, who had a PhD in politics and philosophy, boldly stated that I was absolutely right. This is not to say that I have fascistic inclinations at the present time. It can be agreed that fascism originates as a consequence of the Italian War of Unification, known as the Risorgimento, and as a consequence of the First World War. Hegelian thinkers like Giovanni, Gentile wanted to construct a less evolutionary rigid system than that of historical materialism and the materialistic positive approach of 19th century liberalism, doctrines overwhelmingly attached to empiricism. Fascists like Gentile found that 19th century ideologies like Marxism and liberalism portrayed societal development in too rigid a scope, with doctrinal and ideological development being paired with material production and economic analysis. Therefore, fascism rejects the notion of a historic class struggle or the Foucaultian notion of Western liberalism as being the final form of the evolution of government. For the fascist intellectual, society is constantly in a state of flux, and each century presents new doctrinal needs to the population. There is no level system, so to speak, where society advances from one doctrine to the other, such as with feudalism and capitalism. Ideology is simply response and ever-changing. For this reason, fascists were largely skeptical of placing too great an emphasis on economic matters, as they centered their beliefs on the spirituality of society. The paradigm of fascism rests upon the strife between authority and the rights of the individual. In the 1932 manuscript of the Doctrine of Fascism, Benito Mussolini writes, "Fascism reasserts the rights of the state as expressing the real essence of the individual." This, however, should not be confused with absolutism or monarchism, as Mussolini later made it clear that fascism is not interested in regressing back to the pre-1789 absolutist period. The reason this is important is because 1789 marked the start of the French Revolution, and to thinkers like Mussolini and Gentile, it invoked a sense of disorder, chaos, and unleashed the case for individualistic tendencies. So thus far, we have seen that fascism pretty much rejects positivism and governmental evolution, which distinguishes it from Marxism and liberalism. Fascism also curiously taps into the primordial fear of death, unleashing the concept of the new man, a self-sacrificing individual that does his duty for the state. The logic being that the new man has shed his individuality and self-interest for the greater good of the state, for other people. To the fascist, the state is what crafted the nation, not the other way around. Therefore, to the state, everything is owned. This seems like an extreme variant of civic nationalism, where Hegelian recognition is attained through the energetic activities of discipline, duty, and self-sacrifice. It also constructs the idea that the state is not necessarily tied to a geography or a race, therefore it lacks a racial component. This is in stark contrast to the racialism of Nazism, where antisemitism was at the forefront. It is also shaped by the lack of attentiveness the Italian fascist government gave to the Jewish question, when it was pressured to implement anti-Semitic laws in 1938 in order to appease its Axis partner, Germany. Ethan J. Hollander wrote of Mussolini, stating that in 1938, for example, he gave the green light to a decree restricting Jewish involvement in certain professions. However, the decree was weighed down by so many loopholes and exceptions for war veterans, churchgoers, essential workers, and even members of the fascist party. that enforcement became virtually impossible. It is further testament to the sympathies of Italian fascist Jewish banker Ettore Ovazza, who had an optimistic view of El Duce, even as he and his family were rounded up and brutally murdered by SS soldiers in 1943. This could further be extrapolated by the fact that over 80% of Italy's pre-war Jewish population survived the Holocaust. This number is significantly higher than other Axis-occupied zones in Europe. These factors lead fascism toward a trend of anti-majoritarianism and anti-democracy, being that the fascist state recognized the inequalities between individuals, whether that be through intelligence or disability. Fascism believes that the placement of political responsibility among the majority of the population through universal suffrage is absurd because the majority of individuals are constantly duped into supporting the somewhat secret parliamentary forces. This was evident in 1921, right before the March of Rome. This creates the idea that democracy is a kingless regime that is ruled by several tyrants rather than one. The ease at which populations can be manipulated shows the inequalities that should be controlled rather than encouraged. Therefore, fascism has a quality of restricting freedoms because individualistic freedoms do not come before the freedoms encouraged by the state. Other academics, like David Brown, like to portray fascism as being antithetical to the Risorgimento nationalism of Italy, which sought to establish a liberal state. Brown thought of fascist regimes as being integrally nationalistic, meaning that they would drift toward extreme statism. However, this ignores the often mythical qualities fascist regimes would give to the heroic struggles of the time period. Mussolini himself wrote that Giuseppe Mazzini and Giuseppe Garibaldi were entirely liberal. Hitler did the same thing with the glorification of runic symbolism, Wagner, and the feats of the German war chief Arminius. Therefore, this gives fascist regimes the attributes of being totalitarian, in that political discourse becomes a sort of religion, much like with Stalinism, with an emphasis on authoritarianism. What also distinguishes fascism from all other ideologies, including Nazism, is also the great importance in religion. The last area I would like to analyze is the economic sphere, as fascism entails the economic doctrine of corporatism. Corporatism essentially seeks to divide the economies and industries of states by industries that are represented by interest groups. These interest groups, whether controlled by the state or private enterprise, would act harmoniously for the improvement of the state. Here we see how fascism further distances itself from the economic polarities of liberalism and Marxism. However, corporatism cannot be the single defining factor of fascism because it was also present during the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Corporatism has also been present in Mexico with the Industrial Revolutionary Party, and has also been present through parastatals in Nigeria. Therefore, fascism has a combination of public and private property. It seeks to remove the self-interested motives of capitalistic regimes, however it does not believe in removing the ownership rights over labor. With all these factors at play, we can see the great difficulty in categorizing fascism. It invokes a sense of totalitarianism, Risorgimento revivalism, anti-individualism, corporatism, religiosity, aspects of extreme civic nationalism, extreme statism, militarism, anti-positivism, and so on. Nazism shares many of these aspects with fascism, but the major exception that becomes the norm is a lack of biologically racist components to the doctrine of fascism.